climate change stuff is super scary. I wonder if anyone's talked about religion with it. In 2015, Pope Francis was approached by one of the science advisors to the Vatican, Dr. Ramanathan.
And this is where I lost my audio and video, but that's okay because Dr. Ramanathan talked to Pope Francis for about 3 minutes about the moral dimensions of climate change. And after that, Pope Francis wrote Laudato Si, the encyclical on climate change, leading to a huge spike in climate action from the world's 1 billion Catholics. That's a pretty big deal.
Now, before we think that this was just an isolated incident, one scientist who happened to have the ear of one of the world's most important faith leaders shooting a shot, consider this. In 2006, Edward Wilson, the Harvard biologist and self-declared secular humanist, wrote The Creation, which was an open letter to the Southern Baptist pastors as an invitation to get them involved in the climate movement. Now, Wilson is a well-known scientist. He's won the Pulitzer Prize. And he's taken a lot of flack over the years from the evangelical community over his stance on evolutionary biology. He had every reason in the world, including philosophical differences and just lived experience, to think that this exchange wouldn't go well, but he still tried. Around the globe, scientists are starting to recognize that the level of transformation that's needed to respond appropriately to climate change doesn't just come from scientists alone. We need all hands on deck for this thing. We need policymakers and artists and scientists and normal people and faith communities all to help out. In December 2019, I went to Madrid, Spain for the UN's 25th Council of the Parties on Climate Change, or COP25. I was there as a representative from the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and I spent most of my time being there as a part of a faith community, thinking about the role for faith communities in the climate movement. Now, there were lots of faith communities represented at the COP25, and if you know anything at all about how the COP went down, you know that there was a lot of talk about action without any real action being taken. The goal was to implement more parts of the Paris Agreement, or at least settle all of the outstanding issues that needed to be decided. And in the end, there came to a no deal on the Paris Agreement. Lots of talk, no action, which seems to be kind of par of the course. Now, this is frustrating for me, and especially when I apply it to faith communities as a whole, because I'm a part of that. Because climate change is the single largest threat that humanity has ever faced, and it does seem like the kind of thing that faith communities would be particularly concerned about. Now, I've worked in climate advocacy spaces in a lot of different contexts, and I know how difficult a problem this is to tackle.
Climate change is really like the mother of all externalities. It's a global problem, but the cause is individual day-to-day actions where we choose to drive a car and emit, burn gasoline and emit greenhouse gases. But we're also doing this as part of a system that's hard to change from the individual perspective, but that all adds up to this global problem. And when I talk about externalities, jargon from environmental economics, there are spillover costs. Things like pollution, air pollution, the costs of those accrue to society, but the price of those damages in environment and human health, those damages are not reflected in the price of the fossil fuels themselves. They're not reflected in the price of gasoline.
Carbon emissions, which drive the bulk of the warming that's happening in the atmosphere, are pretty much inseparable from the world economy, and it's not like that ship turns on a dime. And the people who've benefited the most from this carbon economy have invested a lot in avoiding the consequences for it, both in human and environmental costs. They can afford to remove themselves geographically from depleted ecosystems and from the people who have to live there. They have technologies that can purify air and water that come into their homes. They also have enough money to lobby their governments to build polluting plants and factories in anyone's neighborhood but theirs. The people in countries who need to change the most in order to mitigate the effects of climate change are the ones that already have the majority of the power and wealth in the world today. The writer Amitav Ghosh highlights the incentives that they have to hold on to that power and wealth for as long as possible and resist that change, because their power derives not so much from a lump sum as from a monopoly. How much power do they have in comparison to other people? It's in their best interest to hold on to that power as long as possible and maintain the gap between them and those around them. I would love to dig into some of these patterns in future videos, but for this one, I want to focus on the way that science becomes political and some of the reasons that faith communities choose to opt out of these conversations once that happens. So let's get this out of the way right off the bat. The reality of climate change is not a matter of opinion, and the goal of this video is not to lay out all of the evidence for human-caused climate change. I've linked a ton of resources down in the description, so you can check that out if you want to, but we're going to focus on the dynamics between science, the church, and the state as they relate to climate change overall. Science and faith are both concerned with the question, what is true? They use different methods to get there, and that's why they tend to butt heads. There's no real greater sin that someone can commit against you than doing the thing that you love, but not quite right, is there? In a future video, I'll unpack that particular sibling rivalry, but for now let's focus on the concept of truth in general and its political dimensions with political philosopher Hannah Arendt. Arendt writes in her essay, Truth and Politics, that politics isn't really just about the competition between ideological and partisan groups. That's definitely a part of it, but at its very foundation, politics is about the organization of power, whether that power is physical, ideological, emotional, or relational. I'm about to blow your mind, but we live in a society, which means that we have to decide together how we're going to live together, what happens when we can't, and how we decide that. For Arendt, politics in its primary form is persuasive. It's about convincing enough people to buy into the basic tenets of an argument that you can build a stable system around that. So, for example, when slavery was losing support in the United States, white Southerners appealed to other white people who had the political power at the time to try and persuade them that slavery was a natural, worthwhile, even moral institution. Now, they failed to persuade people of that because slavery is not a natural, worthwhile, or moral institution. So when persuasion failed to find new allies for slavery, there were two options that were left: abandon slavery or expand the system of violence that was used to enforce it. When persuasion fails, coercion is the fallback. It's compelling someone through force or threat of force to buy into a system that they may or may not actually believe in for the sake of that system's stability. When you can't get philosophical consensus, you need at least practical consistency in order to keep that system running. Coercion has to be understood in two ways, though. On the one hand, there's the violent form of coercion, which can happen physically through policing or rioting, or economically through embargoes or blackmail. The other kind of coercion that Arendt talks about is based on what is true. Now, this sounds like persuasion, but that's not quite right. For Arendt, the most important political truths aren't philosophical. They're not the kind that you can get to by argument or dialectic or locking yourself in the cabin all winter and going a little bit insane. The most important truths for politics are facts. The hallmark of factual truth is that its opposite is neither error nor illusion nor opinion, not one of which reflects upon personal truthfulness, but the deliberate falsehood or lie. Senator Daniel Moynihan says the same thing in a different way. You are entitled to your own opinion, but you are not entitled to your own facts. Let's say, just spitballing here, that someone were to stake their claims for authority on religious claims, which included the idea that the sun revolves around the earth. If someone, theoretically named Galileo, described the motion of planets around the sun and invited other people to do the same using methods that could be verified and repeatable, that would have been a nightmare. If people could find by their own observations contradictions to the claims to authority, they would start to wonder about the other claims that that authority was making as well, especially justifications that said it was natural for that authority to have power. Facts are coercive because they're persistent and they can't be persuaded out of existence. The only options available to those in power when confronted with facts are either to accept them and change their course, or lie about it and eventually have to put in some legwork to maintain that lie. No tyrant in the world is powerful enough to make 2 and 2 equal 5. A pillar of Enlightenment thought is the idea that rationality can be used to create the perfect society. Thinkers like Immanuel Kant and Thomas Hobbes, René Descartes, and Sir Thomas More put out arguments for the enlightenment of society inspired by the scientific revolutions of Galileo and Isaac Newton. The better science got at explaining the world complexly, the more hopeful people became about the prospect of us someday finding the formula to organize society based off of pure rationality. In Western democracies, these ideas are still hugely influential and inform most of the bedrock for political and economic thought. The problem is everyone has different ideas of what their best interest is, In large societies where interdependence is harder to see, or in cultures that heavily value rugged individualism, the basis for this rationality can get obscured. Plus, it was plenty easy for these dudes in the 1700s to say that it would be sure great if all the rational actors just happened to be in charge, and oh, look at that, we're the ones who get to decide who counts as rational. When rationality became a social grace, it was taken for granted that scientists operated in some sort of purity of rational thought, free from any social prejudice or political preference. And to be fair, the scientific method does try to control for these variables. Under ideal circumstances, scientists should be dependent entirely on their data and the quality of their experimental design. But those controls are so important because science is never done in a vacuum. Scientists are also individuals and citizens with their own interests and likes and dislikes, all of which are going to form the scaffolding of their work. Individual scientists and science's governing bodies get to decide whose data matters, what data gets published, and which research will get funding. Sociologist and philosopher of science Stanley Aronowitz says that this doesn't diminish the value of science, it doesn't make it less true. The critical theory of science does not refute the results of scientific discoveries since, say, the Copernican revolution, or since Galileo's development of the telescope. What it does challenge is the notion that science and its discoveries are exempt from ideology, critique, deconstruction, or historical investigation that might be trained on any other discourse, literature and art, politics, social scientific theory, and so forth. Again, this doesn't make the science any less true. It just reminds us to consider which questions are and are not being asked. For example, in the United States since 1938, a large portion of scientific funding has been coming from just the military, which is naturally going to be more interested in some questions than others. Science, for all its well-intentioned efforts, can't be considered in a vacuum. It also has to be open to criticism for its effects. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring is one of the best examples of this working well. Carson showed the unintended consequences of using DDT, a wildly effective pesticide, on the environment with the kind of emotion and scientific clarity that arguably kicked off the modern environmental movement. Truth confronts us with a choice not of what to believe, but what to do about it. Carson showed the environmental consequences for using DDT for pest control, and that left the US with a choice. Either we could stop using DDT, or we could keep using it and also be admitting that we knew the consequences and didn't really care. No amount of philosophical disagreement was going to change the fact that DDT makes bald eagles lay thin eggs. So in Madrid, I sat in on a deliberation about how to measure each country's carbon emissions, kind of taking account for the total that they were putting out. I was excited about this conversation because I am a nerd, and also because I was excited to learn about the logistics of kind of international scientific collaboration. I was disappointed, though, when the entire conversation devolved to a bunch of bureaucrats arguing about whether or not cutting down trees should count against your carbon emission total. Now, a reasonable person with a basic understanding of the carbon cycle will be able to tell you that cutting down trees, which take up carbon from the atmosphere, means that there will be more carbon in the atmosphere because there's less getting taken out. That's basic science. But a lot of countries there have really big forestry industries, and so they wanted to have their cake and eat it too, and the entire conversation got held up on the extremely sexy topic of wood harvesting. Oh, Turkey piped up in this debate and was like, I don't get it. What are we talking about? This is like chemistry 101 stuff. This is just like remembering to put down our units. Yeah. Go get them turkey. That's right. Ghosh calls this inaction on climate change in spite of overwhelming evidence the great derangement. To be confronted with the truth, especially one as dire as climate change, and not change course, is almost a criminal level of neglect. He warns us that to continue on our current course would be an acknowledgement that the ideas of equality and justice from which the dominant political imaginary draws its legitimacy have never been anything other than grotesque fictions, designed to procure the opposite of those professed ends. I like to imagine the scene in John 20 where a recently resurrected Jesus shows up to doubting Thomas as going a little differently than you might have heard in church. Then saith he to Thomas, Reach hither thy finger, and behold my hands, and reach hither thy hand, and thrust it into my side, and be not faithless, but believing. This is how I like to imagine it. Oh God! Stick your finger in my ribs! Truth can be pretty unsettling when we come across it. Thomas also gets a bad rep as the doubter from this story because he, like pretty much any reasonable person, didn't want to go running around Jerusalem saying that actually the Romans kind of suck at killing people without any good cause. Thomas, like plenty of other people, did see something and then change his beliefs based off of what he'd seen. See, Thomas wasn't really a half-hearted disciple. When Jesus found out that his friend Lazarus had died, he wanted to go back to Judea to visit his tomb and his family. Thing is, the religious authorities in Judea wanted to stone Jesus, and so his disciples, pretty reasonably, said maybe let's not. Thomas, though, said, yeah, let's all go together so that we may die with him too. Thomas is a ride and die kind of friend. What Thomas is looking for in John 20 isn't really that unreasonable to ask, even in the context of his own faith tradition. The Hebrew Bible is full of people asking God to identify God's self before they go along with some harebrained scheme that could just as easily be inspiration as insanity. Faith is a central theme in the Bible and for the entire life of a religious person, but I think a better word to convey the meaning of that faith in modern context might be trust. And trust has to be built. The Bible is an anthology of stories collected from people living in wildly different circumstances over the course of thousands of years. It can be read as the story of God building trust with humanity over the course of those thousands of years by revealing different aspects of God's self to humanity in different places and times. In Scripture, there are accounts of people talking with God directly, God performing signs to reveal aspects of God's self, and the ultimate reveal, God choosing to take on physical form and become human. God with us. So the question for believers is, why do you trust in the things that you claim to be true? There are a lot of factors to consider when thinking about that question, and different believers will have different relationships with them, but there is a model that I think is pretty useful. In a widely influential theological primer, How to Think Theologically, theologians Howard W. Stone and James O. Duke recommend using a tool from the Methodist Church called the Wesleyan Quadrilateral, which sets up a matrix between scripture, tradition, experience, and reason.
The Wesleyan Quadrilateral is named for John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, and seen here looking his absolute best. I'm not a Methodist, so we'll turn it over to an expert to explain a little bit more of what it means.
Hi, my name is Tyler Sitt. I am a United Methodist church planter, which means that I start churches from the ground up, and I am the pastor of New City Church in South Minneapolis. Right now, New City Church is in a month dedicated to prayer and spiritual practices, and we are urging people to listen for the voice of God. And one of the questions that I always get back from folks is, how do I know if what I'm hearing is the voice of God, or it's just kind of an idea, or maybe it's the voice of something else? Like, how do we know that it's not just society speaking into me? And that's when we start talking about the Wesleyan Quadrilateral as kind of the quality assessment of the voices that we're hearing. It's basically saying, like, if you're feeling some type of inspiration, then filter it through the witness of Scripture, tradition, experience, and reason. And if it goes through all of those things, then it's probably at least adjacent to the Holy Spirit. And we have a church that's full of people who really care about climate change and care about ending racism and care about the liberation of queer people and of women. And all of these things coalesce around the witness of the Wesleyan Quadrilateral. Like most environmentalists that I know, I had really significant experiences outdoors when I was a child. I grew up in Eden Prairie, Minnesota, and in a lot of ways I had a hard time fitting in. There wasn't a lot of Asian people around. There wasn't a lot of openly gay people around. And the place that I really found myself and really found connection to God was in nature. I would love to go to forests and see how there were all these bugs and birds and trees and tall grasses, like the amazing forests and prairies of Minnesota. And I remember just seeing all of those as a kid and thinking, like, God made all of these things different on purpose so that they could work together. And if all of these things can be different, then maybe it's okay that I'm different too. So from a really early age, it was like creation was the strongest and first sermon of my life. Like, I've been to church my whole life, but creation was the one that preached to my soul.
Scientists throughout history have told us that God speaks to us with two languages, the language of Scripture, and the language of nature. People of faith from the psalmist to Augustine to Galileo and Newton to George Washington Carver and Mary Oliver have all found God in the majesty of the natural world. If Thomas is guilty of doubting, it isn't because he just didn't accept some real wild claims with no evidence. It's because he didn't believe his friends who he'd known for years. It's because he didn't believe his teacher, who had told him over and over again throughout his ministry that he would die and be resurrected 3 days later. But to be fair, pretty much every other one of the 12 did the same thing when Mary, and Salome came back from the tomb. And Thomas was the first person in the Gospels to call Jesus God, to make the connection between his resurrection and his divinity. That's a whole different leap of faith. Tradition says that Thomas went on to found the Christian church in India. He made it as far east as Chennai before he was eventually executed. Thomas, the doubter, shows us what to do when the truth really sinks into our bones. You can call Thomas a doubter all you want, but you can't call him a quitter. Okay, hold on, but just give me 1 second. Look, I know what you're probably thinking. What about the separation of church and state? And believe it or not, we have some thoughts on that.
The gospel intrinsically has to do with inward transformation and outward transformation. And the deeper we dive into both spirituality and social justice, the more we realize that we can't talk about the gospel without being political. Like the concept of the gospel not speaking to how we relate to each other, how we hold each other as a society, and how we economically deal with each other is preposterous. It's a completely anemic gospel that can't speak to the ways that we deal with each other in the world, particularly with the marginalized and the oppressed.
The separation of church and state has its origins in the Protestant Reformation with Martin Luther and his doctrine of the two kingdoms. Luther was primarily concerned with undermining the power of the Pope and his bishops, who were effectively princes in their own right.
The thought was, if the church used the gospel to justify becoming kind of a traditional political authority, it would have free rein to exploit the most vulnerable in society, and they would have no higher authority to appeal to. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who for a lot of reasons spent a good amount of his time thinking about the church and state, said that the church's relationship to the state should be to consistently ask it whether or not its actions were legitimate. That is it creating law and order, not lack of rights and disorder? He's also pretty explicit about what the church should do in the case of the latter. The church should always be vigilant and advocate for just policies to be implemented, should intervene and care for the victims of state action or inaction when necessary, and when the state is beyond correction, the role of the church not just to bind up the wounds of the victims beneath the wheel, but to seize the wheel itself. I believe that part of the reason that so many churches are reluctant to appear political is because since basically the time of Constantine, the church has always enjoyed some amount of societal power. For the most part, it's downright practical for the church to maintain the status quo. Martin Luther King Jr. observed that for churches that are historically made up of white folks, that status quo is deeply embedded with white privilege. I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for more convenient season. Anyone who climbs into the pulpit is saying at least implicitly, if not explicitly, that they're about to make a statement about the way they believe the world is and the way that the world should be. That can't help but be a political statement, an argument about how we ought to relate to each other. And whoever is in the pulpit says as much by omission as they do explicitly. We confess that we have sinned against God in thought, word, and deed, by what we have done and by what we have left undone. If the church isn't willing to talk about the realities that people are facing in their lives, we can't also wonder why people aren't showing up. The demands that climate change is putting on every aspect of society are extreme. We need to get off fossil fuels as quickly as possible, not as quickly as is convenient. We need to change the way that we live, the way that we consume and drive and plan cities and organize food systems. There's a lot to do, and the important thing is not to do everything perfectly, but to at least begin doing something as best we can and get better as we go. And the silence every day the church doesn't take action is deafening. The truth is political. It always has been, and if the church wants to be a truth teller, it has to embrace that. If that happens to be partisan at times too, that is the fault of the parties, not of the truth. Prophecy is the voice that God has lent to the silent agony, a voice to the plundered poor, to the profaned riches of the world. Jesus was part of a prophetic tradition that was never shy about naming injustice in the particulars. He wasn't crucified because he told everyone to be nice to each other. Truth demands something of power that power, with all of its self-obsession, cannot give. Those of us in the wealthiest and most powerful parts of the world are being stared down by the truth right now. Climate change is the most destructive force we have ever faced, and it is entirely of our own making. It enriches the richest and impoverishes the poorest, and there is no name for that but sin. The question that remains is whether we will let this truth change us, or if we will choose to be liars. If we continue on this course, scientists can show us in greater and greater detail that millions of people will lose their homes. Already deadly food shortages will get worse. Destruction will spread like the plague, and over again, the world's poorest will carry the burden. Anyone who says that they love God and ignore their neighbor's cry for help is a liar, and the truth is not in them. Prophets are calling to us today. They are scientists and young activists, indigenous people and people in poverty, and the earth itself, demanding that we pay attention to what we are doing. The prophets name the broken places and relationships in the world and insist that our only way forward is not more of the same, but to go to and through those broken places, to be transformed by them with a song of hope on our lips. The broken body of the Creator is crying out through this wounded creation, calling for us to follow. Look at my hands. Look at my side. See and believe.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for making it to the end of that video. It took me forever and a day to make, so I really hope that you liked it. If you have any questions or comments about it, please feel free to reach out at theworstideaever@gmail.com. I appreciate your patience with it. I was sick as a dog while making that, and I don't know if you can see that from some of those frames, but that was definitely a factor at play. I'd like to give a huge thank you to the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences for their Science and Seminaries grant, which made this video possible, as well as a big thank you to Dr. Eric Nordman and Reverend Tyler Sitt for their contributions to this. There are a couple other folks that I interviewed for the video that didn't quite make it in just due to the editing, and so I'd like to thank Reverend Rachel Keefe of Living Table UCC in Minneapolis, and Tessa Komnick, ELCA Hunger Fellow based in Washington, D.C. for their contributions. Even though I don't have footage of you, you definitely influenced the production of this, and your thoughts are super, super valuable, so thank you for that. I'm hoping to make a few more videos like this in the future, so if you would like to see anything in particular, or me cover any topics, or if you have suggestions for improvements on future videos, please don't hesitate to let me know. Tomorrow, and I do need to drive a long, long way, and it's way too late for me to be up doing this, so I hope you've enjoyed the video, and thanks again for watching.